I want to ask a question. Does the West want to learn from the majority world, that is like African Christians? This seems to be a difficult, puzzling question to answer. Western theologians certainly express much interest in wanting to learn from the majority world. That, after all, is where the masses of Christians these days live. This, of course, is admirable in a way, but yet it also conceals a puzzle, which to me raises a question: are they serious? The same Western theologians generally know that Africans are and will continue to be interested in their Western theological tradition. And the same frankly applies to the Eastern theological tradition, maybe to a lesser extent because it's just less extensive and less powerful. Of course it would be, they suppose, and it seems fair to so suppose, impolite, if not immoral, not to respond to a demand for knowledge of the old theologies. After all, in West and East, theology has a great pedigree of important thinkers and saints. Once the African sticks his toe into the water of Western theology, however, he's put into a course of immersion. That is to say, fathoming a discipline like theology requires reading widely. The African we're supposedly determined to learn from receives a list of books that expands as the days go by. This, then, is the actual nature of Westerners listening to African theologians. It's like this: you should read book X, Y, Z, and author M, N, O, and P. The Western theologian who so responds to African requests for knowledge is not incorrect. That is the accepted process, and sidestepping certainly would have dubious results, to say the least. After all, new knowledge builds on prior knowledge. Something has, though, typically been missed. As any one theological statement in the West is only correctly understood through wide background theological knowledge, the same applies to Africans' words. Taking Africans' words as if they're a contribution to Western debate that kind of needs correction through wider reading that debate is to foundationally misunderstand the African. Sorry folks, but the situation in the West is mirrored in Africa. As a Westerner's words, also an African's words, are only correctly understood in the light of a massive and wide background knowledge. This means that the course of action for a Westerner that will enable them to learn deeply from the majority world will not be fulfilled simply by listening to someone from that majority world. They need to consider context. Doing so will quickly have the Westerner fault the African if they don't consider context, as the Westerner will then invariably place the African's words into his own context in which they do not fit. The West has barely engaged at all with the formal task of understanding African theology in a way that can contribute to its ongoing formation and evolution. It actually what's needed from the West parallels the task of the African who is learning from the West. The Westerner wanting to engage this task requires contextual background knowledge. Now, there are differences in the learning process. In Africa, there is no selection of books to be consulted. The task of acquiring the context to theological debate instead necessitates sharing in African ways of life. Instead of books, to read in a library, we must share in that way of life, or those ways of life. Now, to get those ways of life, of course, one has to use people's own language or languages. Not to share in African ways of life makes saying, "We want to learn from you," akin to a mockery. There is a need for the development of a parallel stream of Christian theology to that of the Western and Eastern theologies that should perhaps be called, say, Southern theology, for the sake of the majority world. This cannot be carried out helpfully using English. The category structures of English presuppose just too much that is Western. That this is hardly being engaged has me question, does the West really want to learn from a majority world like African Christians and theologians? Or are pretenses at interest largely a show? If they want to learn, there is a library to read, not of books, but of long-term vulnerable exposure to African contexts. Is even one Westerner engaging this seriously?